Okay. It's recording now. Hello, everyone. I warmly welcome you to today's Esports Research Colloquium. And I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to present my research today. And the topic of today's research colloquium is psychophysiological stress in esports. And this is part of my PhD project. A study that is not included in today's presentation is a position stance that addresses the question why and how sport and exercise psychology could research esports. But if you have any questions regarding that paper, feel free to ask me about it in the end of my presentation as well. Before we start with my research itself, I'd like to briefly introduce myself. I am a research assistant and PhD student at Leipzig University, and I'm about to submit my PhD thesis in the next or this month. My primary research focus is psychophysiological stress in esports, obviously, and I'm a member of associations that are listed on the slide. 3 associations address sport psychology. 1 association focuses on qualitative research in sport and exercise, and another association is concerning esports. So without further ado, I'd like to jump into the topic of stress in esports. So far, psychophysiological stress has been investigated in a variety of sport contexts. And collectively, this research has highlighted the relationship and the connection between stress and performance. And given this knowledge and this understanding of stress and performance, we were able to inform specific stress management strategies to increase well-being as well as performance. And since competition is a key aspect of esports, it seems beneficial to understand and inform stress intervention strategies in esports as well. However, so far, research on stress and coping is limited, although it is growing over the past years. And the aim of my PhD project was to provide a greater understanding of stressors, coping strategies, and associated stress responses to inform those evidence-based interventions in esports. Therefore, the research that will be presented today aimed to provide a starting point for future research on psychophysiological stress in esports, to also explore the subjective experience of professional players within the competitive environment and gain insights into the demands perceived by practitioners and strategies used to maintain performance by both players and sport psychologists and performance coaches. To do so, we first aimed at conducting a systematic literature review to gain an overview of studies that have been published on the question of playing esports and its relationship with psychological and or physiological stress, both in competitive and non-competitive settings. We then conducted an interview study to look into the subjective experience addressing stressors, perceived stress responses, and coping strategies of professional players, and moved on to an online survey that focused on stress management strategies currently applied by sport psychologists and performance coaches in esports, and additionally looked into believed performance factors in performance in esports. And the study that is currently being in preparations and has been funded by the DFG, the German Funding Association for Research, also addresses the question from the systematic literature review, but adds the investigation of the stress-performance relationship, which will also be addressed today. So let's start with the systematic literature review, which was the starting point of my research that is addressed today. Playing esports can be considered a motivated performance. And when this is the case, we can argue that this motivated performance is related to psychological and physiological stress responses based, for example, on the model of neuroendocrine and mood responses to a competitive situation. And to gain a greater understanding of stress in esports and then inform intervention strategies in the future, we wanted to gain a first overview and address the questions if or is playing esports in both non-competitive and competitive settings related to stress responses. To do so, we aimed at identifying studies that included or fulfilled the following criteria. We wanted studies that assess stress responses in healthy individuals over 12 years of age that engage in the activity of playing esports on different levels of activity, both in competitive and non-competitive settings. These studies should be quantitative and published in peer-reviewed journals in either German or English language. As a result, we applied the following keywords and looked into databases in August 2019 and found 3,817 records after the duplicates have been removed, including databases such as EBSCOhost, Web of Science, PubMed, and also additional databases such as Google Scholar. And within the search progress, we also conducted reference list searching and hand searching and ended up with 17 articles that meet our criteria for the systematic literature review. Overall, and to make it really short, the results on the question, is playing esports non-competitively related to psychological and or physiological stress, 13 studies were identified, and these studies provided mixed results regarding the stages before, during, and after gameplay. And we concluded that playing esports in non-competitive settings without perceiving it as relevant and as a motivated performance for the practitioners seems to be unrelated to stress responses. On the other hand, and regarding the second research question of the systematic literature review, we were able to identify only 5 studies, and only 2 of these studies reported hormonal responses of the players that engaged in the competitive activity. In addition, 2 studies reported an activation of the sympathetic nervous system, including heart rate and blood pressure, and only 1 study found an increase in anxiety levels in winners and an increase in cortisol. However, this literature review provided us with the opportunity to identify limitations within current studies that influenced these results significantly. Therefore, we argued that although there were only 5 studies, that these studies included limitations that might have impacted the results, that might also have led to more significant stress responses. And therefore, we provided a list of aspects that need to be addressed within future research to provide us with a more holistic and more evidence-based understanding of stress in esports. And these aspects included, at first, defining esports and investigate actual competition. Back in 2019, there was still a discussion about the correct definition of esports. And there's also a podcast that frequently asks participants the question what their definition of esports is. And this needs to be stated within every single article that addresses stress responses in esports to provide them with a understanding of what they are actually researching, because this also influences the sample of the study. Point 2 was that future studies need to broaden their perspective and theory. A minority of the studies addressed psychological stress responses, and if studies in the future would also build their research on stress-related theories, which was not the case of all studies within the systematic literature review, they will also address psychological as well as physiological parameters and provide us with a more holistic understanding of stress responses. Third, confounding variables should be controlled, which means that both external and internal factors should be considered when investigating the stress responses. For example, internal parameters include the experience or the relevance to win for the participants. If they don't perceive the competition or the activity of playing esports is not relevant for them, they won't experience any stress response. On the other hand, external variables that should be controlled and should be reported within studies include the level of competition as well as the game settings. Is it played against other players? Is it played within competition or just a training setting? Then we also concluded that future studies should address different samples, for example, amateur and professional players, but also different esport titles such as Counter-Strike and League of Legends, that they should conceive adequate study designs. For example, some studies that we were able to identify within our literature review did not really include adequate baseline measurements and only focused on phases immediately before competition. And we know that players warm up before they compete against other teams. And this could, in fact, influence their heart rate, which provides us with a limited understanding of the actual response to the appraisal of competition itself. The following point addresses adopting quantitative as well as qualitative research to provide it with a more holistic understanding as well. This includes longitudinal approaches, for example, within interview studies, diary studies, and so on. And lastly, besides addressing critical turning points in performance and the stress-performance relationship, we also need to look into different aspects within esports, such as team dynamics and communication within teams. Based on this understanding, we want to address different points that have been presented. For example, address professional players. We also wanted to assess the subjective experience of professional players. And therefore, we conducted an interview study to explore the subjective experience of professional players. At this point of time, there were already some studies that addressed amateur players. For example, the study by Himmelstein and colleagues, or by Koo and Gui. But they only provided us with an understanding of amateur players. There was also the study by Smith and colleagues on Counter-Strike players, professional Counter-Strike players, but we wanted to move farther and also look into the experience of professional League of Legends players to inform intervention strategies in the future. And the research questions we addressed within this study were: what stressors do these players perceive? How do they respond to it? Or how do they perceive their stress responses? And what coping strategies do they use in order to deal with the perceived stressors? And therefore, we defined some criteria to interview professional players. And as a result, we were able to interview 12 male professional League of Legends players that were approximately aged 22 years, had an average experience of 9 years, and played approximately 57 hours per week. On the right side, you can see a figure that illustrates the rank of the players and their experience. 7 players of the sample were ranked in Challenger, 2 in Grandmaster, and 1 in Master. And the semi-structured interview guide was based or designed according to the transactional model of Lazarus and Volkmann, but also aligned to the model of neuroendocrine and mood responses to a competitive situation by Salvatore and Costa. The interview guide was then pilot tested with 1 esport player and 1 traditional athlete, because it mainly addressed competition itself and did not refer exactly to esports. And we also wanted to address stressors directly to get a real insight into their experience and not frame their responses in some way. and the interviews were conducted either face-to-face or via TeamSpeak, an online communication tool that players are used to, depending on their choice. So they could say, I want to conduct the interview face-to-face or TeamSpeak, and we would act accordingly. Afterwards, data was transcribed and inductively coded by one researcher and then discussed within a team of 3 researchers. And based on this discussion, we were able to identify a variety of stressors that refer to performance expectations, internal evaluation, such as perception of one's performance, team issue, audience and social media, including being the favorite team, or pressure from, for example, social media platforms, and environmental constraints, such as unprofessional environments, including having no coach or having faulty equipment. But the most significant stressors and the most frequently mentioned ones were performance expectations and team issues, which I'd like to present in the following slides. Let's first look at performance expectations. All of the 12 players acknowledged that they experience high performance expectations that they put on themselves. And Michael, this is a pseudonym, discussed the goal of winning and demonstrating high performance in the following way. I wanted to be the best there. I wanted to be by far the best. I wanted to dominate. That was what I demanded from myself. On the other hand, Mark summarized this in a similar way, but adds higher meaning to it by saying this pressure was the worst. In addition to that, stressors that refer to performance expectations also included high self-expectations, mentioned by 6 players, wanting to play without any mistake, mentioned by 4 players, win the finals, and win for a teammate. Overall, this illustrates that players put high demands on themselves in order to perform and also to stay focused doing gameplay. On the other hand, the majority of the players also mentioned team issues, including a lack of confidence in teammates, which was also addressed by Smith and colleagues in previous studies with Counter-Strike players. And Robert illustrates this in the following way. The pressure was insane because I had to always perform, and I felt like I had to perform much more than anyone else because I was on a bad team and I would have to lift the team up. Almost single-handed this, though it was a really hard pressure. In addition to that, players also experience intra-team criticism, such as Mark. People made mistakes, they pointed fingers, the environment was really toxic. This issue has been addressed in recent studies and also recent discussions with colleagues that the environment, especially within League of Legends, seems to be really critical and really negative. And another aspect that was mentioned by 2 players was evaluative pressure from teammates. And this was expressed in the following way. I mean, it was quite intense before because I felt like I was trying to impress. I was trying to kind of impress like the coach and Zero and trying to reach the standards that they expected from teammates. So that was quite a lot of pressure on the team. We also ask players about how they respond to those stressors and how they respond to competition itself before, during competition, and also afterwards. And they expressed that the perceived responses were most prevalent before competition and afterwards, and they seem to be suppressed during competition. And Stephen has described this regarding heart rate as follows. During gameplay, you automatically slow down. Heart rate doesn't go much farther. That's not possible anymore. Heart rate is the highest before the game and then somehow slows down again. On the other hand, this was also expressed for nervousness. John discussed this in the following way. So in the game, it is like that, mostly for me. I'm nervous just before the game, and then when the game starts, 2 or 3 minutes when you're in the game, then it all goes away. Then I'm not nervous at all anymore, then I just play the game. And these aspects addressed by Stephen and John have been frequently mentioned by the players that were interviewed. Interestingly, and in line with previous research, players' best competitions, when they talked about their best competition based on the interview guide, these responses were primarily associated with the expression of happiness, exhaustion, and feeling good, whereas worst competitions were primarily related to sadness, disappointment, and feeling bad and other unpleasant emotions. When we now take a look at the way players try to manage these stress responses and the stressors, they expressed the following: increasing effort, attention regulation, for example, adjusting focus on gameplay, self-regulation, including meditation, social network, consumption strategies, such as eating fruits between game, and dissociation, for example, avoidance or playing passively. We have a question in the chat. Thank you, Joseph. And the most frequently mentioned strategies included increasing effort and social network, which will also be presented in the following slides in more detail. Increasing effort was the most frequently mentioned coping strategy applied by players, besides social networking. And John's quote illustrates how most of the players coped with stressful situations during a competition. I felt this pressure to perform just before the game and just after the game started. I felt all this, but then after 2 or 3 minutes, it was all gone and I was able to focus completely on the game. And then I didn't think about what was going on, about how many people were watching, what pressure I'm under. But I'm just thinking in that moment, okay, I'm playing as good as I can now. In League of Legends, it is like that. You try to do your best in the 3rd, in the 4th, and in the 5th minute, and you are not thinking about what pressure you're under. You don't think about that until after. And this also links to what they expressed to with regard to perceived stress responses. And in addition, players also use strategies such as watching good players, how they play, how they stream, to learn from that, to analyze their own games and to evaluate their losses. But this was mentioned by the minority of the players, these last 3 aspects. On the other hand, social network, which kind of relates to the stressor of team issues, and is interestingly, I think, was expressed by a lot of these players. Robert, for example, illustrated the role of the team environment for coping and dealing with stressors as follows. Funnily, what is wrong? Funnily, I can't do it. Sorry. With pressure, the team environment helps the most. Because if you have a good team environment, then the pressure doesn't even get you. You don't even feel it. Because you joke around, do stuff together, you're friends, and you don't even notice the outs. You live in your bubble and you don't care about the pressure from outside or the comments or anything. If you don't have that, it starts getting in when you hear the criticism. Basically, the team environment works for pressure. And this is a nice introduction of what players expressed within the interviews. Players also describe strategies relating to communication, such as Mark, which links to the first quote. Talking about what you feel, that's also the main thing to cope with anything. If you don't have that, or if you talk about it, it always becomes easier. Overall, players communicated with teammates, with coaches, with friends, girlfriend, and family. And additional strategies that were mentioned regarding social network included trusting coaching staff, for example, during champion selection, spending time with friends, and relying on teammate support. Overall, this study provided us with insights into stressors, perceived stress responses, and coping strategies. And these findings are also in line with previous research from both traditional sports and esports. However, we still have a limited understanding of stress and coping in the non-competitive environment regarding training, for example, and off-season, because our interview guide only focused on the experience that players made within competition and relating to competition. Smith and colleagues, for example, also reported a stressor regarding difficulties matching their work and their activity in esports and their free time, work-life balance, in other words. And another limitation is that the findings only address male League of Legends players and constitute to a type of naturalistic generalizability. We then argued that research on stress management strategies that are used by practitioners, i.e. sport psychologists and performance coaches, could provide us with a more holistic understanding to inform future intervention studies. And that's why we conducted a study like that. And this study aimed to inform the applied work and future intervention studies by addressing the questions: which stress management strategies do sport psychologists and performance coaches use to support esport players before and after competition? In addition to that, we wanted to see whether stress and coping are perceived as important for players' performance. To do so, we designed an online questionnaire that was contributed online via Twitter and other social media accounts and was sent via email to personal contacts. And we were able to get responses from 25 participants, including 7 female athletes, female practitioners that were approximately aged 29 years. And they had an average of 3 years coaching experience in esports. They were able to express their current role in esports, and 8 participants described themselves as performance coaches. Other roles included sport psychologists, performance psychologists, mental coaches, or mental performance coaches. But there were also other roles that have been expressed by the participants. The data collection took part from March to June and lasted approximately 15 weeks, and 11 participants were excluded from the data set because they were not considered performance coaches or sport psychologists. After transferring this data, we inductively coded the data, and this was done by 2 researchers. And based on this coding, was based on the online survey that addressed internal and external stressors and stress management strategies used before competition, 1 and 2 hours before and immediately before, and immediately after competition, and 1 and 2 hours after competition. And example questions that were asked to the practitioners were: what do you think are the 3 main external factors that negatively influence the performance of esport players? And on the other hand, which 3 strategies do you most frequently suggest when supporting players experiencing stress 1 or 2 hours prior to the start of a competitive match? Based on this interview guide and the responses from the participants, we were able to identify the following internal and external factors that were believed by the practitioners to impact performance of the players. And this is a word cloud where the external factors are highlighted in red and the internal factors are highlighted in blue. And as you can see, schedules, performance pressure, communication, an unprofessional environment, and team issues were the most frequently mentioned performance factors by the practitioners. On the other hand, self-confidence was the most frequently mentioned aspect, the most frequently mentioned factor by the practitioners. In addition to that, they mentioned a grinding mentality, which can be referred to the activity of playing and training over and over again for long duration, stress and coping, emotional regulation, anxiety, and attention. And both internal and external factors relate or are in line with results of previous studies, for example, our interview study and also studies by Smith and colleagues with professional Counter-Strike players. On the other hand, the results provided us with insights on stress management strategies that were currently applied before and after competition. And as you can see, 1 and 2 hours before competition and also immediately before competition, the practitioners most frequently suggested that players could use breathing and imagery in order to prepare and moderate their arousal levels prior to competition. Other strategies, which was kind of surprising to me at least, were physical activity that were both used before and immediately before competition, meditation, and self-talk and performance, pre-performance routines. But these are just the top 5 mentioned stress management strategies. After competition, it looked a lot different. Immediately after competition, practitioners used journaling, social support, breathing, walking, and meditation. And on the other hand, 1 and 2 hours after the competition took part, social support was the most frequently used strategy, in addition to providing space and being there if players want to talk, debriefing, performance review, and also physical activity. And I assume that physical activity after competition, 1 and 2 hours after competition, could be used to counteract the long duration of being seated. And there's a question, what is physical activity here? Just not sitting at the desk, or really activity like jogging also? Good question, Till Koppmann. Physical activity. This you just addressed a limitation of the online survey, because players, I can show you, I can illustrate that. Wait a second. Because we ask the participants what 3 strategies they most frequently suggest when blah 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 prior to or after competition, and sometimes the practitioners or the participants just mentioned physical activity or just mentioned self-talk. And this is a limitation because they did not use a lot of words, and we were not able to gain many details from all of the responses. But based on the responses that have been provided to us that were more broad, it seems like the strategies regarding physical activity were really related to warm up and being active, having a short active break, not just not being seated at the desk, but really being active, doing sports, for example. But good question. Thank you for that. Overall, these results were also in line with previous research on both esports and traditional sports, and they highlighted the importance of cohesion, of self-confidence, emotional regulation, and also sleep on the performance of players. Based on the results, we can argue that emotional regulation strategies, physical activity, and emotional support seem beneficial to provide to players, and also seem beneficial to investigate in future research. And based on previous research, it seems beneficial to combine these strategies and provide them to players that are active in competition. Depending on the interview guide and the methods that we used, we are not able to know why practitioners, performance coaches, and sport psychologists decided to use different strategies. And though we have no insights about their decision-making process and the case formulation of their strategies, because the formulation of intervention strategies are based on their philosophical assumptions. Nevertheless, we argue that individual interventions are needed in the long term, and that these strategies should be communicated with coaches and staff that are working in esports to gain the maximum outcome. The limitations of the studies that have been presented are that they are cross-sectional studies, and we need more longitudinal studies in the future that findings only associate with competition and not training settings and off-season and so on. And we have no information on why, for example, different coping strategies or different stress management strategies were used or being provided. Future research should address the considerations that have been made by every single article, and I can share a link to these articles if you are interested, and especially the considerations expressed by the systematic literature review. We need to gain more insights by conducting future studies on the stress-performance relationship, coping and stress management strategies, but also look into additional factors such as group dynamics, social media, and doping. And this should be done within longitudinal approaches, which has been frequently adopted by researchers such as Dylan Paulus and colleagues, using diary studies, for example. And one example that we want to do, and a study that we want to conduct in the future, is study number 4, the experimental study that I illustrated in the first slides. And this study should address the question, is playing esports in non-competitive settings related to stress responses? The same question we addressed in the systematic review. And if so, how does stress relate to performance? To do so, we want to investigate both subjective as well as objective parameters prior to competition, during competition, and afterwards, but start with measurements during training, prior to gameplay and training, during gameplay and training, and afterwards. And parameters should include, for example, affect, perceived stress, and the perceived match importance and motivation to know if training is relevant for the players. And then we can argue it was relevant and might have led to these stress responses. And objective parameters should include cortisol, heart rate, and heart rate variability. This study is planned for the start of next year, and I'm happy to present you with insights into that in the future. To conclude, we were able to provide a starting point for sport and exercise psychology to investigate stress in esports and extend previous research on stressors, stress responses, or perceived stress responses, and coping. We also were able to provide first insights into stress management strategies utilized by practitioners, sport psychologists, and performance coaches, but further investigation of psychological aspects is needed to provide specific and appropriate research, educational, and other consultative services that are currently provided in the field of esports. To end my presentation and to open the discussion, I want to thank my co-authors, Anna-Marie Elbe, Franzi Lautenbach, Phil Birch, Matthew Watson, Ismael Petreza Ramirez, and every single participant and every researcher or practitioner that has helped us to contribute to our studies. That being said, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and or feedback. If you're fine with it, I will stop the screen sharing. Make sure to disable your camera if you don't want to appear in the recording. 3, 2, 1, go. Okay. Are there any questions or feedback? What you think could have been done differently? What you think was done great? There is a question in the chat. You mentioned that you would be willing to share articles. Can you do that, please? Yeah, of course. I just search for the link and then put it in the chat. But if there are any questions, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I think about topics I can address. That's also okay. M, you have a question?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So my question is, once you would have the unlimited budget for studying esports and players and everything that is related to that, how would you imagine the greatest research project you could run?
Oh, that's a tough question and a good one.
Just unlimited budget, unlimited possibilities, you know, co-workers, postdocs, and everything. Like, what would be the perfect research project for you?
A nice question. First of all, I would try to contact you and Phil and Dylan and so on, and get you to Germany. I would contact the main teams in Germany and provide them with funding and money to collaborate with me. But this is not ethical and moral. But first of all, I would move on with the first study I just presented, but trying to include more players, more than 25 players, and then investigate stress responses in training settings as well as in competition, and include adequate and appropriate baseline measurements. In doing so, and given that esports is a constantly changing environment and every game is different, such like every game in traditional sports can also be different, I would try to have multiple measurement points for training and multiple measurement points for competition, not only as we just planned one measurement point for every participant in training and competition. This might be misleading, not one measurement point, but one assessment, and 3 assessments prior to competition, 1 during, and 3 measurement points after competition, and this repeated for training. I hope this was still clear. This would be the first step, and then I would like to move on to an intervention study and see and look into all studies or all stress management, maybe not all, the most frequently mentioned strategies that have been applied by practitioners. For example, imagery. How does imagery affect the performance of players and the stress responses during competition, and how this relates to the stress performance relationship? And in addition to that, I would also like to do something similar to what Dylan did within his latest study, go into the longitudinal approach, conduct diary studies, and also interview practitioners, how they inform their intervention strategies, why they decide to provide, for example, self-talk or meditation, or what they actually meant by physical activity as expressed by Till Koppmann. This would be something to start with. And yeah, there should be a lot of money. And this was a nice question. And I think I will spend some time over Christmas to think about this in more detail. Thank you. Does this answer your question, or do you have a follow-up question, M?
Oh, thanks for the answer.
Thank you. I think Joseph was the first.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. So my question is, you said in this study you conducted, or you had like 25 players, male players. And my question is, you also mentioned their rank. My question is, were these players like ERL players, or were these players like LEC players? Because I think that is a difference in like terms of skill. That's my question.
Of course. I just posted the link to the studies in the chat, and I'd like to address your question in more detail. That's why I just opened the study itself. Okay, I can tell you about the sample a little more detail. So the 25 participants you mentioned were the practitioners, and these practitioners are performance coaches and or sport psychologists. I think you were addressing the interview study with the 12 esport players, the 12 professional esport players, and they were from Germany, one player from each of the following countries: Czech Republic, Slovenia, Sweden, and the United Kingdoms. And they played at least in the second German division or higher, and second or first division, of course. And they competing or playing in esports was their main source of income. So
Yeah,
they were players from the Prime League, for example.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Then this is not a question, just like maybe an offer. Because I'm a coach in League of Legends. I have like a lot of contacts to like high level players, and I'm a big fan of supporting science and studies. So if you feel like you need players or whatever to answer your studies, please reach out to me. I will help as much as I can.
Thank you very much. I think I will do that. I really appreciate your offer. Okay, then we have another question from Eric.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you for the presentation, Oliver. It was really inspiring, as everyone is. My question for today would be, we didn't do that many studies until now in esports, especially around psychology esports. If you could name 3 things you would give practitioners in esports, what would they be? Like 3 base things they could take from science in esports right now.
Wow, where do you come up with those questions? Good one. You mean strategies, or do you mean general things?
You decide.
Okay. That's a tough one. I have to think about that in more detail, but I would say provide them with a sport psychologist and also a performance coach, because as Matthew Watson and colleagues recently addressed, is that they have different roles and different competencies that they should be aware of. And sport psychologists could, for example, focus on the way players provide feedback to each other. And as we know that toxic behavior or criticism within team is something that especially professional players should avoid and focus on their well-being and performance. And to repeat myself again, sport psychologists could focus on things like communication within teams and building greater cohesion and strategies to prepare for competition itself and so on. On the other hand, a performance coach could try to manage group meetings, could set up a plan and provide them with strategies on how and opportunities how to be more physically active and how to inform their nutrition and have a better work-life balance. And these things work in hand quite good, I think, and would be quite beneficial. And the third thing, I'm not sure about that yet. Maybe a researcher that could drop by and support them and be there for questions. I'm not sure. I will think about that in the following and then maybe address your question later or send you a message. But thank you.
I will drop a link to the study you mentioned in the chat, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm not sure who's the next one, but I would move on to the chat and then to Hamish Cox and Dylan. Thank you, great talk. Do you think that the performance coaches that participated in your study had any blind spots with regard to strategy choice? Are there strategies or methods to cope with stress that you think should be used but currently aren't? Good question. Thank you for that one. Also a hard question. Maybe it's my form today, but all questions are hard today. We don't know whether there is a blind spot, but if we compare the sample that answered our questionnaire with samples that were included in previous research on traditional sports and stress management strategies in traditional sports, we can see that their experience is limited, and that limited is less than those of sport psychologists working in traditional sports. And this could, of course, influence their competencies on the one hand, and also influence the decision-making process of what strategies they provide. Honestly, I would have expected more strategies relating to pre-performance routines in esports prior to competition. And I would not expect that practitioners perceive emotional support and being there as a strategy, as well as physical activity to provide to players. But of course, this is really important, and this is something that we need to consider when we want to understand the esport environment and when we want to support players in a holistic way. And this surprised me, and blind spots, based on the data, it was a huge limitation, and that they were able to fill in some words and then move on to the next question, and we don't have really deep insights into the strategies they provide. Just initial insights and just a first overview. But I would say, if I could repeat the study again, I would go for interviews, and not within my PhD, and the time was limited, and that's why we decided for an online questionnaire. But if we have more time available and more resources, we would definitely go for interviews and then ask why they do this. And at this moment, every answer I could provide you to the question, Christian, is speculative in nature. So I'm not sure. And it depends, of course. Okay, I hope this was still satisfying to some kind. And I would move on to Hamish Cox.
Hi, Oliver. Thanks very much for a great presentation. Definitely learned a lot as my first participation in this research colloquium, so thanks for that. My question, hopefully an easier question rather than another tough one. It was just about your experiences with participant recruitment, and how that was kind of perceived by, I guess, both players in the study, and then also from the practitioners. Did you struggle with it? Did you find it quite difficult? Was it something that players were used to? You know, research in esports being quite limited so far. Was it something they had participated in before, or are we kind of quite reliant on offers coming from people like Joseph to support participant recruitment?
Yeah, thank you for your feedback and your question. And yeah, it was, I would say it was not something that was too hard, but also not something that was too easy in terms of player recruitment. When we start with the interview study, I had I just made a post online on Twitter, and then some teams or some coaches replied to me, and I was able to get in contact with the teams. And there was one team, for example, that I tried to visit in order to build rapport and to get to know the players and be able to gain more insights, because they would be more open if they know who is the interviewer, and they would not assume me or myself as someone who's external and just interested in data, but also interested in the persons. And what I was not considering at this moment was that the season was about to end. And then I was able to get to know the 5 players that were part of the team. And when I tried to conduct my studies, there was a different roster. a different team. And I think 3 of the players were still there, but 2 players have changed. So this is something that one might consider when planning and conducting studies. And I did not, but it turned out fine, I would say. And regarding the questionnaire study, I would say that it was more difficult than I expected, because it is just a questionnaire and could be provided or could be completed within the average amount, or the average duration was 60 minutes, which is a lot, I think, but not too much. And I would expect it more than 25 responses. However, the questionnaire was retweeted a lot and was contributed to a lot of practitioners, I think. But in the end, it's a voluntary participation, and I am more than happy to have at least 25 responses that could be used for the study itself. On the other hand, the sample of performance coaches and sport psychologists that work in esports is limited when we look at LTS, for example, and other leagues that list who's part of their staff. And then we can see that maybe only 5 of 10 teams have a sport psychologist within their team, or at least acknowledge it within those websites that I looked into. To conclude, I would say it can be difficult, and I'm wondering how it will turn out for our experimental study. But I hope that, as Joseph just reached out to me, that there are more coaches and more players that are interested in taking part in research and are interested in gaining insights about their bodily responses, for example. But we need to add some value to them, not only have them included in our study, but also have them benefit from our research. For example, afterwards providing workshops and talk about the data that has been anonymized, and give them something back. Good question. I hope this answers your question. Your hand is still raised. Do you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, no, that's great. I'll
Okay.
put my hand down. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Best of luck with the PhD.
Dylan?
Hey, Ollie. Fantastic presentation. Congratulations.
Thanks.
My question, and I'll invite Phil to jump in on this as well, and I'm sure this is something you'll probably cover in the introduction of your PhD thesis, but one thing I've hit with the stress and coping research at the moment is all the different ways to categorize coping. So I looked at problem-focused, emotion-focused, and avoidance coping. There's approach coping. Nichols in 2016 talked about mastery, emotional regulation, and goal withdrawal. As an expert in stress and coping, where do you see coping categorizations going? How do you think you'll be using them in future?
Thank you for your question. I addressed this within my dissertation, and maybe I can explain how I did this, and then you get a grasp of how I will move on with this. I said there are different views and different perspectives on coping strategies, which is totally fine, I would say. And I started arguing that the traditional approaches were these two, problem-focused and emotion-focused coping strategies. Then there was avoidance coping added to it. And there are also different researchers and different theories that add additional categories. For example, Skinner, who I think 13 categories. And this was not done by us within our interview study. At first, I looked into the data and tried to look where is problem-focused coping, where is emotion. Hi.
Hello.
You can unmute. Okay, so I looked into where is emotion-focused coping and where is problem-focused coping. And then I wanted to repeat everything again, because this was a deductive approach. And since we wanted to explore what coping strategies are applied within esports and within professional esports, we thought that we should do this inductively and be able to identify new strategies within the data. And this is why we came up with strategies such as consumption strategies. For example, eating foods between games or drinking a lot of water that was expressed by players to help them staying focused for long durations of time. And some players also mentioned, but this was a minority, and I have to say that with a strong intent. This was a minority of players. Some players used, for example, alcohol to reset their memory and reset what they just experienced during competition, because they were not satisfied with the matches, or they were so satisfied that they want to celebrate. This was also something that we might not have coded in the way we coded it when we have done it based on traditional coping strategies. And in the future, I would still use this approach of being inductive and be open. And in the end, you can still see where are the links, where are the relationships to coping strategies and theories that say there are 2 strategies or 2 categories, 5, and so on. Okay.
Thanks, Ollie. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Just have to read the chat. I'm sorry. I'm working in a League of Legends team in the highest German league as a performance coach, and I would be also willing to help with contacts for future studies if any help is needed. Thank you. I will come back to you. And there's another message in the chat. Hi, Oliver. Thank you for this presentation. One consideration, maybe off topic. I think it would be nice if we will also produce more articles regarding stressors and strategies from an organizational point of view. One of the major problems in this field is the culture of the orgs, such as changing entire roster every split, no free days, unrelenting environments, etc. As practitioners, we do great job with players and coaches, but if the orgs doesn't support the attempt of changing culture, it's useless. Yeah, I would agree. Thank you for this comment. What do you mean by focusing on the organizational point of view? Would you say that coaches should be addressed and staff members, or what was this referring to? And of course, I would agree that there should be more studies with coaches, both in traditional sports and esports, to understand this in a more deep way. Maybe you can specify this to help me understand this more closely. Okay, thank you for sharing, Oliver. I think it's both great and generous of you. Thank you. I see our network is getting bigger and bigger by the day, so great news. Is there any formal network we should be joining, creating in this specific matter? I wouldn't say you should join, but I'm not sure whether you are part of the Esports Research Networks yet. The Esports Research Network is a network that provides collaboration between researchers and tries to benefit research and also practice of practitioners. This could be something, and you could also join the Discord channel and gain some insights into new articles and discussions that take place nearly every day. But I'm not sure if there's you should do this. But in the end, you don't have to pay. You can check it out and then get your own insights. But I can highly suggest joining this network because it helped me getting contacts, helped me networking, and also helped me to talk about my research and share it with others. Are there other questions? I can't see a raised hand or a message in the chat that is new and that I haven't addressed. You can think about another question. I would just talk about another study, because we have some time left. As a master student of mine conducted interviews with, I think, 7 professional players in League of Legends, and he wanted to know how players do perceive and how they appraise the support of sport psychologists. And the sample included participants that were used to support by 6 sport psychologists and 1 performance coach. And the results are also available on ResearchGate, and I can also share them in the chat when I have the time to look it up. And what was interesting was that there are great similarities between the perception of what is important in sport psychologists and sport psychological support in traditional sports and esports, because players perceived it as beneficial when they have an easy access, for example, via WhatsApp and via cell phone to sport psychologists. If the sport psychologists know what they are talking about, if they are familiar with the respective esports, if they are open, if they are if they liked the sport psychologists, it was beneficial. And this aspect was mentioned by all of the participants, and it was quite interesting. And these are just the main aspects that has been addressed, and the effects that the players, the interviewed players, perceived are that they were able to increase their performance. One player, for example, expressed that he was able to be more consistent in game regarding cognitive as well as motor performance, because he said every player can have bad games and this is normal, but he thinks that based on the support he was provided with, he's able to have bad games less often and good games more and more frequently and more consistent. With other aspects addressed communication and team cohesion, that the team was being able to work better together and the environment was more healthy, that they were also able to learn something and strategies that they could apply within their life and their daily life, for example, on setting goals or managing their daily routines. And they were also able to provide feedback and communicate with coaches in a more healthy way. But these are also just some of the aspects that has been addressed. I will link this up in the chat as soon as I'm finished, before the end of this colloquium. Since there is still no question and we have time available and I like to talk, at least at this moment, I can provide some insight into the position stance that I have acknowledged at the start. It has been included in the folder that I linked in the text, and basically it addressed why sport psychology could research esports and how this could be done. And aspects that refer to the why are that we currently have more sport psychologists entering the field of esports, and there is no empirical evidence to inform intervention strategies. And they just transfer strategies from traditional sports to esports, which is not in line with the ethical statements of organizations like the FEPSAC or the ASP. This is one aspect. In addition to that, it is frequently argued that playing esports is linked to negative consequences on the health of the participants. However, there's also limited research to back this statement up, because we would assume that there are also positive effects of playing esports. For example, you have a social environment, you learn how to set goals and to show commitment. There are different things, and we need to know how this performance influences, for example, back pain and depression, and how this interrelates with each other. And we could use the opportunity of moving into esports to investigate these aspects in more detail, and to also not only say esports is bad, don't perform, but to use the opportunity to contact otherwise hard to reach young adults and inform them about possible negative impacts of the performance itself. Yeah, these are just two aspects. We also addressed financial aspects and methodological aspects, because research would benefit from more standardized studies where players are seated, and we can investigate, for example, decision-making processes in a more standardized way. If you are interested, the link is in the chat, and you can also ask your questions now or via email and Twitter. Okay, thanks for the overview, Ollie. Thank you, Ismail, for your feedback. Are there further questions? I'm done talking without questions. Okay. Seems like there is no question at the moment. Once again, feel free to send me an email to say you are interested in my research, and maybe you want to collaborate or network with me. I'm fine to do this. Then I just have to say thank you for attending today, and thank you for maybe watching the video. I appreciate that you dropped by today and listened and asked great questions, even though they were hard sometimes. And I will think about your question, Eric, in more detail, the third aspect, and your question about future studies with unlimited funding. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Have a nice week, and see you next month, next year in January, where I think Matthew will talk about, Bienke will talk about his research on emotions in esports. Goodbye.